Hi there, welcome to Questioning Behaviour. This is the first episode of a brand new podcast where we get to ask all of the questions, including the who, what, where, what, and why.
You're the dummy that don't believe in science.
I am going to be one of your hosts, Sarah, and I'm here with my co-host, Merle. Introduce yourself.
Hi everyone, my name is Merle van den Akker. I am a PhD student in the Behavioural Science group of the Warwick Business School. I am not actually British, as you can probably tell by my accent, I am Dutch. And as we are recording this during the great times of COVID-19, I am actually also recording from the Netherlands. So I hope you get all the good Dutch vibes from my voice in this recording. What more can I say about myself? So as I mentioned, my PhD is in Behavioural Science. I actually specifically look into contactless payment methods or payment methods in general, because I'm curious to see how they affect how we handle our own money, but also how we perceive money and whether this actually makes a difference in how we handle money with regards to how often we spend, what we spend on, and if we are willing to get into debt for it. Because of course, most people know that if you're spending with cash, you're less likely to get into debt than if you're spending with a credit card. So that's the type of stuff I'm looking into. So I'm very much in personal finance. I'm doing this together with Neil Stewart and Andrea Izuni, who are both from the Warwick Business School. And we get on well enough to make the PhD work, I suppose. It's a nice thing to say about your supervisors.
Yeah, I'm sure they're listening.
Yes, oh yes, I'm very sure they are. I'm sure I should send this to the both of them and then just be like, hey, you're being put on blast. Prepare yourself. You have to be real nice to me from now on. So that is me. That is Merle. Then let's now move on to Sarah. Sarah, who are you?
Who am I? Such an existential question. But the good thing is that it's very unlikely that you will ever mix up who we are, because we do have different accents. So you're welcome. My name is Sarah. I am.
You're welcome.
Yeah, you're welcome. Yeah, it's
great. Just
selling point.
Move on from that. Who are you,
okay.
Sarah?
I am currently recording this from the UK in my parents' house. I'm sure lots of you might be able to relate to the situation right now. We are currently recording during the coronavirus epidemic. So we are socially isolating, but trying to remain social. And I am also currently doing a PhD. I'm in my third year. And actually, that's how I met you, Mela. We started our PhDs around the same time. So what a blessing that I walked into your life. I'm sure you agree.
We did actually meet at Warwick. So you did actually walk into my life. I have dibs on that. I have dibs on that.
I do remember us meeting as well, pretty clearly. I don't know if you remember.
I do.
Yeah. We were in a circle, each taking it in turns to talk about our own research and why we were doing a PhD. And I think I remember I was talking about behavioural science, just very excited and in an eager way. And that's when Merle was like, oh my gosh, I'm interested in this stuff too.
Which is funny because our topics aren't remotely similar. But for the context between Sarah and I, it was friendship at first sight.
It was, really. Yeah. Our eyes locked across the room and I thought, this is someone who will easily be roped into making a podcast with me in 3 years. And here we are.
Yeah, I mean, it has to be said for Sarah. She has her eye on like a long-term horizon. She showed up with a plan and it worked.
I did.
So another question that we got asked for our introduction, because we did actually reach out to you via the socials, was that a lot of people wanted to know why we did a PhD. So I'll jam that into the introduction as well. I decided to do a PhD after I had a couple of job interviews with some big consultancy firms that I think I shouldn't name because I don't want to get sued. I didn't like their approach. I didn't like their employees. I liked absolutely nothing about them. I then actually approached Neil, who was then my teacher, completely lost in the world, had no clue what I wanted to do. He asked me specifically, what is it that you like? Like, what would you want from a job? And it turned out that I effectively described a PhD to him. So he then took me on as a PhD student. And then I asked Andrea to be my second supervisor. So that's how I actually rolled into a PhD, to put it very briefly.
Pretty smoothly, actually.
Thank you. I've tried really hard to make this podcast not, 3 hours about me just talking about how I got into a PhD, because I can make that a very long story. And the last question to end my introduction on is a lot of people wanted to know, why did you do the PhD? Because a lot of people want to know what our career aspirations are. I always thought I wanted to be a professor as soon as I started the PhD. I was like, okay, I'm going to do this, academia all the way, 100% academic, want to be a professor in under 10 years. It's completely unrealistic, by the way, for those of you who have that dream. But now that I've been in academia for 2.5, close to 3 years, that career aspiration is very much shifting. But I think that might be a topic for later in the podcast.
Well, so I got into the PhD in a very similar way, I guess, to Merle, sort of maybe a classic way of I was doing my master's at the University of Nottingham. I was doing a master's in behavioural economics. And part of why I started to do the master's was just because I didn't think that I knew enough about behavioural economics, coming straight out of an undergrad in economics. And I just didn't feel qualified to go out into the world and become a behavioural economist, a practitioner. So I did the master's. And after the master's, I still didn't feel like I knew enough about behavioural economics. And I think this is a pattern that remains to this day, that the more I learn, the less that I think that I know. That's Dunning-Kruger, right?
Yes, that is exactly Dunning-Kruger.
Okay.
So that's
Shout
the
out to Dunning-Kruger.
First behavioral science fact in the house.
Yeah, so, I mean, this will be a common theme of us dropping in bad behavioral science jokes throughout the podcast. So if you enjoy that, I'm sure you'll enjoy this. But my PhD research is mainly looking at medication adherence and looking at behavioral type interventions that we can use to help support patients taking their chronic medications. And I'm doing this from a very experimental approach, so setting up RCTs and experiments online, which has been really exciting. And I kind of really want to carry on doing behavioral science no matter where I end up. So, I mean, I think, like Merle, I'm looking at academia, but also looking outside of academia. There are sort of pros and cons to both, I think. And an ideal situation would be to live my Miley Cyrus dream of the best of both worlds.
Yeah, it's the dream.
Of being a practitioner in the wild, outside of academia, dealing with real life applications and being able to have an impact on people's lives, but also having the freedom and, the freedom of curiosity that academia brings. But yeah.
That's a pretty good introduction. Now, for those listening very, very closely, you might have realized that Sarah calls her work behavioral economics and I call my work behavioral science. And it probably would be a good idea if we explain to you what the actual difference is, because this is gonna come up throughout this episode and probably throughout however long this podcast is gonna run. So I think it's a good idea to explain that. So Sarah, you're a behavioral economist. What makes you a behavioral economist?
From my perspective, being a behavioral economist, I call myself that because of my training in economics.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. So I would call Sarah a behavioral economist as well. She has an undergrad in economics, a master's in behavioral economics, and is doing a PhD in behavioral economics, which she has continued to do in economics departments. Like, that is a textbook behavioral economist, if you don't mind me calling you that.
I'm not sure if that's an insult or a compliment, but I'm going to choose to take it as a compliment.
I think that's very, very smart. So I, in my opinion, can never be called a behavioral economist, and the reason for that is actually my background. So my undergrad I did in Maastricht, and I did it in liberal arts and sciences, in which it's kind of a choose-your-own-adventure type of degree. You choose your own courses, and you hope in the end it sort of makes sense. My courses are fully psychology, statistics, economics, and game theory based, but I am not fully trained in economics, so I am not an economist by default. My master's, one of my masters, I did at Warwick University, which was done in behavioral and economic sciences. This is not behavioral economics. This is categorized as behavioral science. So I'm a behavioral scientist because by default, I'm not an economist. So you're probably wondering, why do we need this long-winded explanation before we actually get into the questions that you asked us? It is quite important to know that these things are not as interchangeable as people make them seem. And a lot of the questions we had is about, what type of PhDs are you doing, and what is your difference between the expectation of the PhD? And a lot of you have also reached out to us by asking about tips to get into the PhD and what type of PhD would fit the profile that you have. And if you're not properly trained in economics, meaning undergrads and masters, the chances of you being able to get into a behavioral economics PhD are quite slim, and in some countries they are none. In the Netherlands, if you don't have a full economics background, you can't get into a PhD in behavioral economics, but you
I
would.
didn't know that.
No, the Netherlands is really rigid when it comes to that. It's really, really
Wow.
rigid. Yeah, you need every step in line with what they have planned for you. I think this is gonna maybe smooth out, hopefully,
Yeah.
but no, currently it's very, very rigid. Um, Not every country is like that. The UK is quite good. When it comes to that, with the UK, you just need to have proven that you've got good grades and you know how to study, and there's
Right.
somewhat of an overlap. But yeah, in some countries, you're gonna run into issues where if you're not a fully trained economist, you will never be able to get into behavioral economics, and then you should just become a behavioral scientist, just like me.
I mean, I think it's really quite sad because a lot of it is just identity. And I know you feel quite strongly about, not being called a behavioral economist and having that distinction of I am a behavioral scientist and not a behavioral economist.
Mm-hmm.
But often these terms are used interchangeably, and potentially where we're going in the future is that the word economist in behavioral economist is not really going to become meaningful in the way that
Yeah, it might.
it is now to some people.
I know for a fact we're gonna talk about this in a later episode, uh, but it is actually quite good to know, especially when it comes to the field of practicing, that it is very difficult to determine who is a behavioral scientist, who is a behavioral economist, and who is claiming to be either of the two and doesn't qualify for either of them. But that's for a later episode.
Yeah. And I think I should say that actually my undergrad in economics, it didn't provide me the training that I was looking for to become a behavioral scientist. I mean, that's part of the reason why I kept on studying. For me, I was just sort of like, okay, fine, this is all really boring. When do we get to the interesting stuff? But, we don't know I don't know the counterfactual. I don't know how I would feel if I hadn't have had that economics training. I mean, the only thing I really liked about the economics undergrad was how much maths I got to use, which may be the nerdiest thing I've ever said.
This is the end of the first part, in which we've just given you currently no longer so brief introduction of ourselves and our stance on the debate of behavioral economists versus behavioral scientists. We're both behavioral scientists for sure. Is just to some extent, well, actually, textbook example: Sarah is a behavioral economist. I am not. Do with that information what you will. It might make a difference in how we approach the field, how we approach certain questions, and what type of advice we can give you. Because obviously, I know nothing about doing an undergrad in economics. I just don't. I didn't do one. So keep that in mind when we now dive into the questions that you actually asked us about doing a PhD in behavioral science, or in Sarah's case, behavioral economics.
And we should say that part of this podcast, even though we both have opinions and we both have knowledge, part of doing this podcast is getting to talk to people who are experts and getting to ask questions that we generally don't know the answers to in a very naive way. So hopefully you'll get to hear a lot more of that and not just of us talking to each other. So we reached out to you guys on Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter, and we asked you what questions that you would like us to answer, right, as a way of getting to know us, general questions about the PhD, our own experiences getting into research, and you kindly delivered. So we're going to go through and talk, I'll give our answers to some of the questions that you suggested. The first question we got was, why did you do a PhD rather than gaining working/business experience?
Yeah, I'll start. So From the initial introduction, you've already heard that I did actually try. It was a very half-hearted try at getting into business straight out of my first master's. Actually, for context, my PhD was a 1+3 program, so I did a master's in behavioral and economic science, then got into the PhD, but had to do another integrated master's within the PhD, so I currently have 2 master's degrees. Is that useful to you to know? I'm not sure. Is this useful to me for getting a job? Probably also no.
We're already so overqualified at this point. Just throw in another master's. You're showing off at this point.
I'm just showing off. It is what it is. I'm showing off my absolutely useless second master because I'm that type of person. No, so within the first masters, as soon as that master started, I did apply to some graduate schemes and some jobs in again the big consultancy firms, because I don't think naming names is a good idea. I had experiences doing these types of assessment centers, which was fine, and then I had a bunch of interviews at most of the things I applied to. And I did 2 interviews, I think, at 2 really big consultancies down in London. Again, I'm not naming names. And I hated it. Absolutely hated it. It was terrible. The people were terrible. I mean, maybe they're lovely in their personal lives, but on a professional level, there was absolutely no vibe. As soon as I came into the building, the hairs on the back of my neck just stood up. I wasn't really nervous. I was just really, really uncomfortable, and it seemed like such a mass production factory. You get into this scheme, in 2 years you're gonna have this title, in another 2 years you're gonna have that title, or you're just gonna get fired, whatever. And I was both uncomfortable and underwhelmed and not impressed, and I really didn't want to be there. So I went, as I said before, to one of my teachers then, and he suggested I do a PhD based on the description I gave of something I wanted to do. And the description I gave him was that I wanted to better understand why people made absolutely terrible financial decisions. For example, to get into a payday loan, or to spend beyond their means of spending, of stuff like that. Yes, I mean, I love money in general, which is a very interesting statement, but I predominantly love researching money. And so yeah, it made sense for me to get into a PhD. Also, for context, when I finished my first master's, I think I was still 21. So I was relatively young. Yeah, I was a baby. I mean, by that stage, I'd been in the UK approximately a year. As I mentioned before, I'm Dutch myself, which is also I did my undergrad in the Netherlands as well. And maybe that's also a reason why I didn't really enjoy the interviews I had with the business side, the consultancies that I mentioned before, because maybe I was just too young for it.
Do you think that if you went back now at 24? Are you 24? You're 24. Yeah. If you went back now, do you think that you might have a different experience, or do you think that the environment wasn't really for you?
I think I would still feel like the environment wasn't for me, but I also think I'd be a lot less affected by it, if that makes sense. So by the time that I was actually in the UK and applying to these jobs, I think I might actually have still been 20.
Really young.
So I was a 20-year-old guppy. Yeah, I was really young. Or I'm just really desperately mixing up the ages, is also possible. But I was really young when I went into it. I'd just been in the UK for several months maximum, just gotten into this master's. And just, it was very overwhelming. And if something is uncomfortable and overwhelming, it is incredibly uncomfortable. Whereas I don't think I'd be overwhelmed now. I would walk into these interviews, be like, I don't like you. I don't think we're vibing. I'll answer your questions and I'll just get out. I don't think it would have affected me as much. But knowing this now, I also don't think this type of consulting is for me. I think the PhD has helped me a lot to figure out that if I were to go into business, what type of business I'd go into, where my stuff would be very much financial research or personal financial research based. And I wouldn't be surprised if I ended up working in the research unit of a bank or a financial planning type app. So for me now, to get out of the PhD, I wouldn't mind going into business. But I think it was a very good idea for me to choose the PhD and further develop what I know in behavioral science and the research methodology behind it, and to actually also grow as a person. I genuinely think I would have struggled as such a young person to, throw myself into a career like that.
Do you think the PhD has allowed you to sort of be your own boss in a sense, rather than working for someone else?
I think that there are benefits to working for someone else. And if I now look at my first year of the PhD, which was also this integrated master, so what happens is you take a lot of courses still, but you also do research and you prepare your research at the same time. What happened was that you're not thrown into a very new environment. So taking courses is something, by that stage I'd done for 4 years, if you're just looking at university education, which was fine. And then at the same time, my two supervisors and we were figuring out what the next step would be topic-wise, get the literature review ready, get the experimental setup ready. And in the beginning, it was very structured, but I also still kind of felt like, I was both working for the teachers in this degree, because you did have to meet your deadlines. And I also felt like I was sort of working for my supervisors. They still felt very much in charge, if you will. And this is a feeling that I started losing in the second year when I no longer had any courses, and you would go days or even weeks on end where it's just you and your research, and you just have to figure it out yourself. You are in charge of this research. And I do think this gives you a lot of personal growth, and this does test how well you can work independently within your own structure and within your own limits. So I think from a personal growth perspective, a PhD is a bitch, if I may say so.
It does force you to confront things about yourself that you may not like. I mean, for me, also, a very similar story about getting onto the PhD. I pretty much just came straight through undergraduate, masters, into the PhD. I didn't take a year out. And to be honest, when I applied to the PhD, I didn't expect to get in. I was sort of, no, seriously, I applied for PhD funding, and I went into it being of the mindset that, if no one is going to offer to fund this PhD, this research isn't valuable to anyone. So I won't do the PhD and I'll go and do something else. And I was fully committed to the idea of I'd leave the masters and I'd go and look for a job. And I was excited by that. I thought there were lots of interesting jobs that I might like to do. So when I received confirmation that I'd secured funding for the PhD, it was almost like a oh shit moment of seriously of like, oh god, now I have to do it. Because I'd, this might reveal a little bit too much about me, but I had really set myself up as if I was going to fail. And, fail in my application, but in a way that if I did, that it wasn't the end of the world, because I knew that the chances of me getting in were very, very small.
You were cushioning the blow a bit, whereas you absolutely didn't have to. So this is an interesting thing. Sarah is the opposite of overconfident. Sarah is underconfident.
I mean, it just means that we balance each other out, which is why I like you, Bella.
Yes, I am quite overconfident. A lot of people have told me that, because when I applied to the PhD, I was told, oh, you should probably apply to multiple programs just to be sure. And I was like, nah, it's gonna be fine.
That's interesting, because I only applied to 2 programs. I actually applied to a PhD program that was linked with the Behavioural Insights team.
Oh, nice.
In my master's, when I'm looking at companies, institutions, policy units that are applying behavioural insights in the UK, the first one that really comes up, the most prominent one, was the Behavioural Insights team. So I was looking to see what sort of jobs that they were offering, and I saw that they were offering this PhD. So I actually put together a PhD application to apply to do this PhD in London, and I thought, well, as I've already written an application, I might as well apply to Nottingham, right, which is where I was doing my master's. I got rejected from London and accepted at Nottingham. So
there you go.
I didn't apply widely. It wasn't really my goal necessarily to do a PhD. Like, I didn't really have any plans on staying in academia. But, I got the funding, and I thought, this is going to be 4 years of extra training in my mind, right? 4 years where I get to just expand on my skills. I get to run my own projects. I get to build up a portfolio of work, which I can then go out, into the real world and sort of say, look, I've managed to accomplish something, I'm capable, I have skills, I can code, I can design experiments, all these things that I wanted to know how to do, but that I hadn't really had an opportunity to do, in my master's and undergrad. So that's sort of how I approached the PhD.
So you approach a PhD with the idea of, no, I'll probably not get into a PhD. I'll probably have to look at the business. Oh, I got into the PhD. Fuck business.
Yeah, pretty much. You'd say it better than I could.
We are terrible role models. We are absolutely... Can you just imagine someone now starting their undergrad, really interested in behavioral science or behavioral economics, don't use them interchangeably, please. And then now does a master's and really wants to get into a PhD, and we are their role models.
But I think it's interesting.
How terrible would you feel? We're terrible.
But no, I think it's an interesting point about role models, because, to be honest, as I was studying economics, I didn't really see anyone in the academic department that I could relate to, or that...
Oh no, me neither. Nothing.
Because I didn't really have that, person that was taking my tutorials that I thought, oh, okay, well, she's doing a PhD. I never even thought that I could. I wouldn't say... I'd say, I'm a pretty good at doing exams. I'm pretty good at studying. I'm pretty good at academia. I've been able to prove that by getting this far. And I've been generally interested. But I never really even thought that I was qualified enough to do a PhD program.
No, it's actually funny that you mentioned that, because I remember it. I hadn't considered doing a PhD either until my then teacher, now supervisor, just told me, have you thought about doing a PhD? I think you'd be good at doing a PhD. If you write up a research proposal, if you would consider it, I'll supervise you. It was the easiest thing, where he's just like, I've taught you. You come from a quality master's program. Quality meaning he taught it. Shout out to you, Neil. And he was just like, I'll take you on. It was such just the opposite of a big deal. It's like, yeah, I'll take you on. Whereas by this stage, all my teachers had been male, and easily above 40, which is also not helpful if you're 20-something yourself and female. That doesn't help. And I think I met someone who was someone you could count as one of my role models, because I do really, really admire her. And she taught me for the first half of my second term. By that stage, I had already applied to doing the PhD. The person that is my role model is hopefully someone will also get onto this podcast. Her name is Gana Pogrebna. If I properly pronounced that, she's Polish. I probably butchered that. But she's an absolutely amazing person, and she, I think, for a lot of young women, is an excellent role model if you want to make it in behavioral science. And she's gone absolutely beyond behavioral science, because she's also in big data and machine learning and AI. You don't have to be into AI to admire her, but she's an absolutely cool person. But it took very long before I met someone, or just saw someone who was something of a role model to me. And I hope academia does change in that regard. I really do hope so.
Now being on the other side, right? So now we are both, you could argue, academics, right? We're interacting with students, we're, face-to-face time, teaching tutorials. I've actually had loads of encounters with young women on the undergraduate economics program, where, we're having a sort of a supervision or an office hour. And I just mentioned to them, have you even thought about doing a PhD before? Because I hadn't at that point. And a lot of them gave the answer that I would have given at that age in that point in my life, of being like, no, I'd never even really thought about it before. And I said, well, you're obviously really interested. And people have really responded positively to that, because I don't think anyone's ever thought to ask them before, have you thought about going into academia?
But I mean, it does make a lot of sense when I look into, and this is not, I'm gonna say economics, but this is not just economics. I think, and we're getting a bit off script here, but I would like to mention it. I think higher education currently, especially on an undergrad level, because we both teach undergrad, is becoming absolutely insane. There is 300 people, if not more, in a lecture, and you've got 10 seminar groups of 30 people, if not more. and there isn't the time, or there aren't just the resources, with teaching hours, etc., available to actually, sit down with a group of these kids, to quote them as that, because they're definitely not
They're,
kids
they're only like
anymore.
5 years, 4 years younger than you, so be careful.
Yeah, literally. I always call them like kids, and they actually don't, they don't respond badly to that. They actually think
They
it's
are
quite
scared of
funny.
you, though.
So these quote unquote,
You know that.
yeah, they are scared. Most people are scared of me. It is what it is. So these quote unquote kids respond really well if you actually sit down with them and, ask them like, hey, what is it that you want to do, whether they've got good grades or not so good grades, like just this one-on-one conversation of just being like, hey, I see you, and I do actually, put value by the fact that you have a certain idea of what you want, or the fact that you don't have an idea of what you want. But obviously, if you have 10 weeks, at least that's the Warwick term, to teach 300 people the basics of economics, or in my case, I've taught marketing and consumer behavior and coding and that type of stuff, you don't have that time. And that does actually worry me a lot, because in that case, if no one has ever sat down with you and be like, hey, what is it that you actually want to do with this undergrad or with this master's, or, whatever, you're hopefully going to, figure it out yourself. But with help from someone who knows this area much better, just through sheer experience, it does actually become a lot more difficult, and it does actually worry me. I think I got a really specific example for this, which is also based on a lack of representation. I had a student who was in their last year of undergrad. I will tell you absolutely nothing about this student because it's supposed to be anonymous, or at least there's no gain of outing them, I suppose. But this student was non-white. And they were a bit, so we had several interactions because I taught them, and it was just they asked me if I would mind checking their applications to a university in England, which is very good. I'm making this as vague as humanly possible. They were applying to a university for specifically a master's degree within the behavioral sciences. That's all you're getting. And yeah, they asked me like, hey, would you mind checking this personal statement, and like the motivation letter and all the type of stuff you need for a PhD application? And I was like, yeah, just send it over. A week later, I still didn't have it. Another week later, I still didn't have it. So after a while, I was like, hey, I know these deadlines are coming up, because PhD deadlines are quite, sorry, not PhD deadlines, master program deadlines, they're quite, deterministic in the UK. I think all of them fall effectively into the same month, which I'm pretty sure is somewhere in March, if I'm it's quite early. So February, March, say. And I still don't have anything. So I just asked them, because I also don't want to reveal their gender, why they hadn't sent me anything. And they were like, well, like I'm really not very sure about it. And I just took them aside and I'm like, listen, you sounded really enthusiastic about applying to this program. Now you're completely flaking out. Like, what's up? And they initially weren't very responsive to it, and they were kind of, just they were beating around the bush, as the British do. I will give you this. This person was British. That's all I'm giving you. A British person of color. That's all you're getting. And I was just like, okay, so this conversation doesn't seem to help them at all. I was just like, listen, if you can actively tell me now that you've got a backup plan, like a good solid backup plan to applying to this master's, I will let you go. So you can enjoy the rest of your day, do more tutorials or whatever they had to do. And they just looked at me, and I was like, you don't have a backup plan, do you? And they were like, no, maybe I'll spend a year working. I'm like, what work are you going to do with just an undergraduate degree? Like, you clearly want to do this master's. You have absolutely no backup plan. You've got about a week-ish left to this deadline. Send me the stuff. I'll edit it on the same day that I get it. Just do it. And they were like, no, but they were coming up with excuses to the extent of like, no, but the deadline's so close, I'll never get it ready. I'm like, stop whining and just do it. Like, just, you're coming up with excuses. Something is going on there that you clearly don't want to tell me, which is fine. I mean, I'm not a personal tutor. I am not a person of confidence. So I understand that maybe they wouldn't like that, and which is fine. But then they did send me, I think, they did send me the stuff. I did check it. That was done, I think, in approximately 3 days. And by the end of it, they told me that they did get into that master's
Wow.
program, and I told them I was really, really proud of them. So I was really, really happy. But they told me that the reason that they didn't want to apply, or that they were pussyfooting around it, which is I love that British word, it's a great word, is because they had absolutely no representation of themselves
Crazy.
in academia. So they
That's so
didn't want to do
sad.
it because they already felt within undergrad. Now I have to admit that Warwick is whitewashed. Like Warwick is very white, by my standards at least. I think by most people's standards. And that they didn't even see themselves much represented in undergrad. And it wouldn't get better in masters. And they knew it and they felt that. And that for them was very much a motivation to maybe stay away from that. And I think that is an issue that academia really, really needs to solve, because the teachers are white, predominantly male, predominantly quite old. You know, that's not the message you want to send. It's just
and
not.
really, the people who lose out are all of us, right? We're losing out
Oh,
on the
absolutely.
research and the perspectives that people can bring to the discipline and academia and practicing, that aren't currently being represented. It's a crime in my book, and I know that this is a particular example, and one which we have the privilege maybe not to have experienced ourselves in the same way, but this does link to this idea of imposter syndrome, right? Or RuPaul would call your inner saboteur, right? Which I mean, I know that I feel pretty much constantly, right? This voice in your head that tells you you're not good enough. But I think the secret is that everyone who has reached this point, right, who is looking, at progressing their career, whether it's in academia or outside of academia, particularly within academia, has this imposter syndrome, and it's invisible, and it can be really, really crippling. And if you don't see anyone else suffering from it, and it really feels like it's the truth that you don't deserve to be here, right? That you're not contributing anything.
That your work isn't useful and you're not progressing as fast as everyone else is, and that is an indication of you not having been fit for the program. Yeah, that is a constant, which I think actually quite nicely moves us to the next question, which is what is the difference between the expectations you've had of the PhD and actually doing the PhD? And I think we're both in our third year, we're both about 2.5 years in, and I do feel that when I started the PhD, I thought that by this stage, first of all, I would know what I wanted to do with quote unquote the rest of my life, end quote, exactly, and that I would feel good in my field, as in not like, oh, I'm having great emotions or whatever, but as in I would feel like coding wise, I knew what I'd be doing. That when I'm designing an experiment, I would know what I'd be doing. I'd be very sure in myself. I'd be like, I know this. I've got this. I've read all the literature. Like I am an expert. Whereas if someone asks me now, are you an expert in like applying behavioral science to personal finance? Anyone who knows me says yes,
Right.
and I would say, oh no, I'm a rookie.
Yeah.
And that I think is for me one of the biggest expectation difference. I thought I'd know a lot by now, but I think this is Dunning-Kruger. I know a lot, and therefore I know I don't know a lot, which is just terrible.
I think something that I thought that the PhD would bring would be publications, right? I thought that I'd be published, okay? And I am so far from ever having a paper. So, and it's difficult, I think, when, the whole rat race of academia, right? You are competing with everyone in your field, it feels like, everyone in your cohort for the same academic positions. Whether that is the case or not, the type of person that the PhD attracts, it's the high achiever, right? It's the person who's always come top of their class, right? Who isn't used to feeling stupid. And, I think the PhD does a very good job of
making you feel stupid.
Well, bringing you a little bit back to reality on one hand, but on the other hand, I think the PhD is a great place to develop a mental illness.
I think it's an excellent. I think the PhD or this type of very unstructured level of high performance is the breeding ground of the worst mental illnesses. By the way, if you're in business and you're working 80 hours a week, I mean, anything above 35 hours a week is intense enough. We're not saying that you're not prone to mental illness, but when it comes to doing a PhD, there is an abnormal percentage of people who are struggling with anxiety and depression. I think those predominantly, which very often come from the fact that PhDs are very
Yes.
unstructured and they lend themselves both incredibly well and not at all to social
Right.
comparison. Where, for example, I would compare myself to my colleagues in the behavioral science group who are doing vastly different things. So different topics, different methodologies, they have different
Mhm.
supervisors. So can you compare yourself on technically speaking? No, you can't. Do you compare yourself? Yes. What is the outcome?
Yeah.
Not good. And this is how most PhD students work. Like as soon as someone else has a publication, you're really, really thrilled for them for 5 minutes, if that. And then you will have 5 hours of existential crisis of why don't you have a publication? It doesn't matter that your methodology is completely different and your supervisor hasn't talked to you in a month and their supervisor is actually really good about it. Like it can be so many external factors, you won't take them into account, and it will take 5 hours, a good cry, a call with a close friend, a bottle of wine, and probably a tub of Ben and Jerry's before you feel somewhat decent again. Or, whatever your
Yeah.
vices
And I
are.
do think that the PhD can be incredibly isolating. I mean, I've seen
Yes.
so many memes online about, PhDs reacting to social isolation and people being like, well, what's new? We've been socially isolating. Yeah,
Yeah, this
I've
is
been
my
socially
life.
isolated since I began the PhD. And I mean, I think I've been incredibly lucky with my cohort of PhD friends that we're
Yes.
really good at socializing. Like we're really good at doing things outside of the PhD, particularly exercise. I mean, I have actually become addicted to exercise. I'm going to self-diagnose myself to cope with the stress of the PhD, to balance my life, right? To give myself something outside of academia with which I can feel worthy, right? With sport, that's my way of saying, hey, you're actually quite good at this, or here's something you achieved
Yeah.
today, or you did that really well, and having a community and a social group outside of academia for me has been really important.
No, it's actually really good that you mentioned that because this is actually for our current cohort. So this is not a reflection on the state of the universities, but I actually know Sarah's cohort quite well as well. We are actually all friends. At least I would like to think I'm friends with all of them, and they are really really nice and they are very social. The issue with my cohort is that they're not. So I know everyone from my cohort, especially I know everyone in the behavioral science group. I like everyone in the behavioral science group, but they're not a cohesive bunch. I think the people I'm currently closest to, they don't live in the vicinity of Warwick University to begin with, so that makes it much more difficult. And some of them don't even spend the majority of their time in the UK. And you should probably prepare for the fact that not everyone is gonna get, when you apply it to the PhD and when you get into the PhD, not everyone gets the experience of having a very cohesive cohort around them. That a PhD can be isolating, not because you're in your own topic and it's your own work and there is no one is working on the same projects as you for example would do in a master's degree. You're not working towards the same deadline on the same topics with the same assignments, you're just not. But additionally, what you have in a master's is that you are stuck with each other in courses, you see each other a lot, whereas within a PhD, that is not at
Yeah.
all the case. Sometimes you end up with really good office mates, you have good banter, you have good friendships forming, and sometimes you don't.
Yeah. And that's just the luck.
Yeah, it's just draw of luck. And you can end up with either. I think it's a 50-50 situation. And like Sarah said, I think really good advice would then be to find although you do actually have a good social group, but you will have to find your social interactions somewhere else, because if they don't come from the PhD, like no man is an island.
Nice.
Yes, I know some literature. You're gonna have to find it somewhere else. So either sign up for some exercise groups, or hopefully still have a bunch of other friends around at the respective university that you are at, outside of the PhD program. But make sure that you don't fall into this type of isolation, because when it comes to mental health issues, isolation drives a lot of them.
No, I don't think I would have been able to continue doing the PhD if I didn't have the support of my peers. It's been really crucial, I think. It's been a really crucial part in me enjoying the experience of the PhD, is having that support. So it is important, but it can be outside of your control. And I think that's something that's important to recognize. What is within your control, right? In terms of your experience of the PhD. What's interesting, I think, about your PhD is that you did your master's project on what would be almost like the introduction to your PhD topic. So you went into the PhD knowing what your research proposal was, knowing what you would be researching.
Yes.
You had a head start, so to speak.
Oh, absolutely. This is a massive privilege. And this is actually what throws off a lot of people, is that they think as soon as they start the PhD, they're gonna hit the ground running. I've got a newsflash for you. You've just handed in a research proposal. I don't think I even know people who are actually doing their research proposal in the PhD. It is...
Yeah, that's
Oh,
me.
are you really? Is that actually... Oh, that's really impressive. No, with most people, their supervisors are more like, yeah, just write that down, that sounds nice, this will get you hired. And then as soon as you actually meet them, so in the British term at the start of October, and you're starting to set up your research, so keep this in mind, you're setting up your research, this takes long.
I mean, from my experience, I was applying to do a PhD with a vague idea of an area of interest. So I guess unlike you, who knew that you wanted to look at money and very much about the psychology of money, and it feels very defined. For me, all I knew was that I wanted to do research in behavioral science. I wanted to do research that involved an experimental approach, and I wanted to do something which was an application of behavioral insights. So relatively policy focused.
That is really vague. Yeah,
no
that is really
particular
vague.
idea of what behavior I wanted to study. So when it came to writing up my proposal, I really just was looking at what was happening in my department, and there was an example of a research project that had just sort of was in the process of wrapping up, which was an RCT to do with trying to increase voter registration. And I got into the PhD. I was in a good position where I knew my supervisors, and my supervisors knew that I wasn't tied to this project that I'd written. That I was just interested in doing something that was an application. And so, really, my PhD project that I'm doing at the moment, it came to me. It was a very serendipitous. Someone approached my PhD supervisor and asked him whether or not he would be interested in doing a project on medication adherence. That would be very much a behavioral economics application, an RCT working with Boots as a partner, and he thought of me. So really, he brought the project to me after I'd gotten into the PhD, and luckily, I thought it was really interesting. So I think that's maybe like a myth or a preconception that people might hold, is that you need to know what you want to study before you go into the PhD.
It does help, but it's not nearly as much of a prerequisite as people think, because this is actually really, really funny. So although I ran my pilot study at the end of my master dissertation, at the end of my master's year as the master dissertation, my application for the PhD I actually did at the start of January, and what I wrote has nothing to do with contactless. So I wrote the research proposal, which was actually, in my case, a longitudinal Quant meets
Wow.
qualitative research methods,
Wow,
study of how
really?
people, yeah, and it was supposed to be um, a nudging-based RCT where several groups of people that were somewhat matched in their characteristics would receive different nudges to get them to save more, see which one was most effective, yada yada. Ironically, I think someone who did their PhD started their PhD 1 year before me was doing something very, very similar. So I'm not
Right.
entirely sure how I got hired on it to begin with, because someone else was doing this already. But then when we had to start my master dissertation, so I had both Neil and Andrea as supervisors, but Neil was on sabbatical when I actually did this dissertation. So it was just Andrea and I. And by this stage, what had happened is that contactless payments had become incredibly popular in the UK. And we were looking at that like, well, if you want to do a PhD with real life or business application, ingrained in it, you have to look at the real world and be like, what's new, what's interesting? Well, what's new? Contactless payment. Is it interesting? I'm like, yeah, sure. It's money, right?
Well, you can make it interesting.
I can make it interesting. And every form of money is interesting to me. Like, how is it being spent? Is it being spent? How is it being handled? So that is how we actually selected my master dissertation topic, which then rolled over into my PhD topic. So
Right.
we're actually running ahead of the questions, because one of the questions asked via the socials was like, how did you select your PhD topic? So here you go. We had different things in mind, and then we ended up with something else thanks to our supervisors. Is this common? Yes. But another question, what would you argue are important skills to have as a PhD student?
Okay, why don't you say your top 5 skills?
Oh god. Like, as in the top 5 skills I have, or the top 5 skills I think would be good to have?
The top 5 skills that you think would be really good to have.
Okay. Do I have to start, or are you gonna start?
Okay, I'll give you one. I think definitely time management.
God, yes. Absolutely.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
that's something that you can learn. Like, you don't
True.
have to be good at it, and you don't have to have perfected time management walking into the PhD, but something that you should try and really improve upon, especially in that first year.
Yeah, I think flowing from time management is so time management in this case would be knowing what to do when and properly having it scheduled in, right?
Yeah.
I think flowing from that is my first one, which is setting boundaries. And you need
Ooh.
to set boundaries early on. What are you willing to do? How much of it are you willing to do? When are you willing to do it? And what aren't you willing to do? If you're not willing to work on the weekend, don't work on the weekend. Just don't do it.
And I think that's quite a good policy, right? Having some separation of research and your life outside
Yeah.
of research.
Because you need to have a life. You need to have a life.
They do say that, researchers, it's very difficult to switch off. It's very difficult to stop thinking about that research project
True.
when you leave the office.
Oh,
So
it's true. My brain never leaves the office. Never.
mine does too often.
Okay, nice.
I have to force my brain back in the office. I'm like, come on now, actually think about it.
Okay, so we've got time management and resilience. What is your next one?
Did you just say resilience?
Sorry, shit, no, I said setting boundaries. Well, resilience is a nice... resilience is my next one, not your next one. No.
I'm stealing that one. Resilience.
Fine.
Resilience, for
Come
sure.
up with
Yeah,
another one then.
I think that you will experience a lot of negative feedback in the PhD, and I think it's very difficult not to take that negative feedback and take it to heart and have that be the only thing that you hear. You're gonna, yourself be having periods of self-doubt. So being able to separate, okay, well, that's just a comment or someone's opinion. It's not necessarily a reflection of my work. Okay, I can have a project that doesn't go well. That doesn't mean that I'm not a good researcher.
True.
Being able to make that separation, I think, is really important, especially for your mental health.
Yeah, no,
Okay.
that's absolutely true. That's absolutely true. But then at the same time, I think another important skill to have, but this again follows from resilience, is to have grit. Like, you're gonna have shit days. And sometimes you feel like you're a shit person, a shit researcher, whatever. That doesn't mean you get to give up. I'm afraid. So the PhD has very little to no actual objective feedback of, hey, you're doing well or you're not doing well. You're not doing well as objective feedback is just your supervisor telling you that what you have done in like as a culmination of several weeks or months of work, that it's just not good and it's just not publishable. That is an objective set of feedback, or you failing your annual review or your upgrade. That is objective feedback. And then objective positive feedback would be getting your stuff published academically or in industry papers, because this happens as well. That is objective feedback of, hey, you're doing well. This happens so infrequently that technically speaking, you will have very little to no feedback at all. And for a lot of people, like positive or negative reinforcement is really, really important to stay motivated. Well, this is not how a PhD works. Like, if you don't get constant feedback, and if that is what you need to get motivated, I'm very sorry, but likely this PhD is going to be very, very rough for you. Because if you're used to getting patted on the head or screamed at all the time, whatever your lifestyle may be, this is going to get really, really rough, because there is none of this. You need to have some serious grit, self-discipline, or self-determination. I don't really know what the right English word for it would be, but you need to motivate yourself, because no one else is going to do it.
And if grit is also a bit of stubbornness, I sometimes think that the reason why I kept on doing the PhD was just sort of out of pure stubbornness.
Yeah.
Of being like, well, I'm not going to quit because I don't feel good about my research today. Like, don't tell me what to do, brain.
Yeah.
The conversations I have with myself.
In all fairness, I've had these conversations with a data set where I just look at the data set, this is actually pathetic, and I look at it and it had crashed on me multiple times. Nothing would run, nothing would work, and normal people, like, they quit after an hour. I looked at my laptop screen and I was like, fuck you. I am not going to leave until you give me the result I desire. How dare you reject me? It was really dumb. But yeah, this is it. Whereas at the same time, I would argue that also knowing how to stop, know when to stop, but I think that is more within the setting boundaries realm.
Yeah.
If you've worked like a 9-to-5 day and or whatever you've worked, because like the 40-hour work week just isn't that applicable to PhDs. It really isn't, for good or for worse. But if you've worked and you feel like you've worked enough, which most PhDs never really do, but if you feel like you've hit your daily targets and you're tired, or you would so much rather be doing something else, and you feel like you are physically, mentally, spiritually, emotionally, I don't even know, suffering from it, you are allowed to stop. Yeah. If there is one thing I hate so much, and now we're just going back to the advice for prospective PhD students, do not, I implore you, do not go onto these bullshit motivational, like, Twitter accounts, Instagram accounts, I don't know what type of social media accounts, where they tell you that you need to work 60 hours a week, or you need to hit at least 10 impossible targets per month to be considered good at your work, or a good person, or God knows what. Like, these people who like humble brag or like complain on Twitter or LinkedIn, you have thousands of them where they're like, oh, I feel so bad. I only worked 65 hours this week. Normally I work like 140. There's not even 140 hours in a week, but it doesn't matter.
Maths has failed us, don't worry.
No, there is 140 hours in a week. There's 168 hours in a week, right? But you can't work 140 of them. I'm not good at maths, okay? It's not really my strongest subject.
That's all right.
But stay away from this fake positive productivity bullshit. You don't need to work 60 hours in a week. You don't need to work 40. You don't need to work 120. You need to work the amount of hours that you can do, feel comfortable doing, and get your work done during. And those are 3 very different things that you can jam into a Venn diagram, and then somehow via some Nash equilibrium formula, you'll figure out how much you should be working.
Are you sure you're not an economist, Merle?
Oh, yes, I am. My game theory, my love for game theory goes deep. So I've always been a massive fan of Nash. But Do not fall into this trap of comparing yourself to other people who have absolutely nothing to do with you or your work and being like, oh, but I've only worked half the amount of hours that they did. Yeah, well, if they work 80 and you work 40, congratulations, you've just worked a normal work week.
Yeah. I
Don't beat
think
yourself up. Do
it's
not.
a very dangerous trap to fall into because, I mean, I think we have to constantly be reminding ourselves that the news that people share about their lives is often overwhelmingly just the positive stuff.
Oh, yeah. Oh,
And the
look at me,
reality,
I've worked 120 hours, my PhD is done, my work's published. Yes, well,
yeah.
you've also just recently lost your partner, you're financially unstable, and you're probably struggling with depression.
Yeah.
Tell me that.
I mean, and the reality is when you're living a PhD, you will face a lot of rejection, a
Yes.
lot of failure.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the stuff you're doing is not going to work out, right? You'll be rejected from,
Journals.
and that is part of academia, is the rejection. And that's not really represented on what you see online. So,
No, it's never represented.
yeah. So it's a dangerous trap, and it's something that people should try and be aware of. Don't be so hard on yourself. You're probably doing fine.
Then maybe that's the last skill to end on. Just to
Yeah.
be kind to yourself, but also cut through the
Yes.
bullshit. Like if you ask someone how they're doing and they're telling you all these great things, like, oh, I've just, in the past month I've published 5 papers, I've lost 60 kilos in weight, and I've won the lottery. It's probably not true though, is it?
And just say, good for you.
Yeah, just say good for you, and then, grab a bottle of wine, grab your pint of Ben and Jerry's and go cry in a corner. It's all fine, mate. It's all fine.
No, I think that's a really good message. Be kind to yourself. Don't be too hard on yourself. Try and do things that you enjoy. Don't feel guilty
Have a
about
life outside the
taking an afternoon off.
Absolutely.
That's something that we're all, guilty of, is feeling guilty for not doing work constantly.
I've worked during Christmas. I think that was when I realized that maybe it wasn't completely normal.
Yeah, there is life outside of the PhD. The PhD is not everything,
No.
So if you are still interested in doing a PhD after this,
Yeah, we are really doing a PhD is actually can be really, really fulfilling. We are still doing this, so this should tell you that we do actually enjoy what we're doing. But doing a PhD is very often very misrepresented. You're not gonna be a professor in 5 years. You're not gonna come out of a PhD, depending on the field, with like companies, throwing themselves at you. A lot of companies, especially from a very hardcore business sector, will find it very difficult to understand what you have done as a PhD student.
yeah.
Like you might run into issues with that as well. I'm not saying you have to go into academia with a PhD. A lot of people don't, but just be very realistic and talk to a lot of people who do have this experience before you start it yourself. Because the idea of a PhD, so the expectations that we had of doing a PhD and the reality of what we're doing now is vastly different. So different. And it's not a bad thing, but it is a thing.
And I think just remember that this is 2 people's experience out of how many thousands of people do PhDs every year.
Yeah. Or that's someone, who's doing a PhD, they might have such a vastly different experience from the experiences that we are having, and that's completely fine. It's just there is such a range to the experience that a PhD is, and I'm still looking for someone who's being really, really honest about these things. I feel like we should end on the last question before we're literally talking for 2 hours.
Okay.
A question that came up a lot is whether you actually need a PhD in behavioral science. And the original question was very much focused on whether they need a PhD in behavioral science to actually apply it to business contexts. And I suppose they also meant that whether it makes you more attractive to hire as an expert in behavioral science, if you will.
Can I answer this one?
Of course you can.
Nope.
Do you need one? No, you're actually, if you want to go into business, if you want to do nothing with academia, and if your stuff isn't research focused, there is no fucking value to doing the PhD unless you're very much intrinsically motivated, because the extrinsic motivation of, being more desirable in a job market or having a better grasp of how to apply behavioral science in a business. These are not the type of skills you get during a PhD unless, and this is a very big exception, but it's not actually happening that often, you will get a lot of business-oriented skills if you get into the PhD being sponsored by a business where the business or the company that sponsors you lays the foundation for what your topic is, and it is directly applicable to the business or company that you work for. These are business-focused PhDs. They are very rare. They do happen. Within behavioral science, this I think is a very unexplored option, but for operations management and human resource management, for example, if you want to stay in the social sciences in the business context, these are actually quite well-known types of PhDs. Within behavioral science, they're not as well known, but as Sarah has mentioned, there are PhDs which are, for example, funded by the BIT, which will be more structured towards a certain topic.
And I think what I would say is that the PhD is yours, right? It's going to be whatever you make of it. So if you go into doing a PhD knowing that you want to be working with businesses, right, that you want to be doing research that's applicable to a non-academic audience, then you can totally do that. And I know people who, work with external partners, they collaborate on research together, and that's absolutely a valid way forward for the PhD.
Absolutely. But there are people who very easily do this if they have the right network when they come out of their master degrees, or if they had work experience before they did their master's degree. From that work experience, do the master's degree, become a behavioral economist or behavioral scientist, depending on the degree, then go back into their network and apply those skills, now having a clear degree showing that they are an expert. Because if you've done an MSc in behavioral science, you know quite a bit as well.
Yeah. And I think that you don't need a PhD. And I think that is the bottom line of, I guess, our answer. I'm speaking for myself. And one of the things I think that can sometimes be a bit of a pitfall is that a PhD teaches you how to speak academic, right?
Yeah.
It teaches you how to communicate your research to an academic audience. And I've seen this experience with some of my teachers at undergrad or even at master's level. That they're teaching students within academia, but there's often this gap between the fact that they know so much about their subject and they're used to communicating with people who also know a lot about their subject. Difficult then for them to communicate with people who are naive about the subject.
Yes, because if you've been in something for a number of years, so I've deep dived into contactless for like 3 years now. I think I know every theory there is on why people treat different payment methods differently. Unless someone has come up with a theory in the past week, then I might be lagging a bit behind. But I know quite a lot about this, and other people would argue I'm somewhat of an expert. But I might. So if I've never went to conferences or if I never done any external lecturing to people who I know aren't specialists in behavioral science, then my stuff will come across as quite hardcore and just very ivory tower-esque, where I'm communicating in terms where I think, I'm sure everyone knows this because I see it every day. But just because I see it every day, that doesn't mean that everyone in behavioral science has ever even heard of it, let alone normal people. And that's not a discredit to anyone who's not an academic. It's just, if you're not an academic, or if you're not even remotely interested in, payment methods or behavioral science as a whole, why on earth would you know what the pain of paying is or the transparency of methods? You wouldn't know that. I don't expect you to know that. And as someone who is more focused on working within a business context, this is something that is much more emphasized, because within business, there is much more emphasis on being able to sell your work. Whereas within academia, you're selling your work to other academics, not to people and other companies. And there is a vast difference.
I agree.
Oh, thank you.
Well, I feel as though maybe you guys have got a better idea of who we are, what opinions we have. our realm of expertise or non-expertise, depending on how you look at it. If you would like to hear more, please carry on listening. I think that's what I would say.
Yeah, the next episodes are up. Please do binge. The episode after this is actually an interview-based episode, which was going to be the main framework of operations when it comes to this podcast. So normally we have a quick chat on a topic, introducing it to you as the audience, and then we call in our expert on behavioral science and a different topic. The expert that we're calling in next episode is Mark Brooks, who is an expert on applying behavioral science to online dating. So that is what we're aiming for now. We hope you enjoyed this one. We really hope we didn't discourage anyone from doing a PhD, because it is an amazing experience, but you need to be so aware of the peaks and the troughs.
Yes,
the peaks and the troughs.
I agree. And if you do have any more questions for us, they could be questions about, the PhD experience, or even questions, more general questions, then please do get in contact with us via our social media. We are on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, so you should be able to find us somewhere on the internet, I hope, if that's all working.
Yeah, that should be fine. Well, in that case, guys, thank you so much for listening to this introductory episode. Please let us know what you thought of it on the aforementioned socials, and we hope you have an absolutely amazing time and an amazing day.
Yes. Thank you so much. See you later.
See ya.
You're the dummy that don't believe in science. All your projects always be denying. You're the one alone.